I've had quite a lot of people contact me recently asking about grief and how to navigate it and what to do about it and how to survive it. And so I thought I'd come out to my favourite spot in the garden, my favourite rock, and sit up here for a while and just maybe put some thoughts down. So probably you know that I'm no stranger to grief. Grief has visited my life many, many times over a 20-year period. And just to let you know, if you don't know me, that I've experienced, the loss of loved ones in different ways, through to illness, through to old age, sudden traumatic death. I've had grief to do with my own loss of my own physicality and illness, and losing my life through prescription drug addiction, so many things. So I'm no stranger to grief, and it is a very, very confusing area, I must say, and I'm not an expert in it, but I do know what I've learned through my own experiences. So I'm going to share them with you here if you'd like. So first of all, I always say to people that grief is a bit like boarding a ship, that you've been given a ticket for a destination that you don't even know where it's going, and you didn't even ask for the ticket. And it's quite literally like that. And so grief is about heading into a journey that we've no idea how it's going to end up. We've no idea where we're going to be and how it's going to be, and if ever we'll ever arrive. It really is one of the most frightening, confusing experiences to go through. And for me, grief is a serious journey. It is a journey of discovery. It's a journey of losing ourselves. It's a journey of exquisite pain. It's a journey of confusion. And one of the biggest things that people contact me about is they say, I don't know how to do this. I don't know if I'm doing it right, because there's always an expectation, I think, set up by some other models that, at some point in time, we have to be hitting certain milestones or hitting certain areas of our grief, as if we're working our way forwards, as if we're on a trajectory of recovery constantly. And unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. And so people get very confused because they find that they're in a particular place and they're thinking, is this the right stage? Or if they're not doing something when they feel they should be doing something, then they lose their confidence, and then they start to question themselves, and then they think, maybe I'm sick. And that's the first thing I always say to people, that sadly, grief is not a pathology. Grief is not an illness. Grief is a psychological experience of deep loss. It's an experience of losing deep love, having love to give that we've nowhere to channel it. And there are even experiences of grief, of course, don't forget that they're in loss of people in our lives and they're still living, and that can also be very complicated and confusing. But I'm just going to sort of talk about my experience of grief and what I found to be true about it. As much as I like to think in my experiences of grief, particularly in traumatic loss, I kind of almost hoped that I would fall apart. And I did to some degree, but I always say to people, you will fall apart, but you will fall back together, because the human body and the human mind and the psyche are designed to withstand grief. We may not want to withstand it. We may not want to survive it at times. And at times it feels so intense that we really, truly feel we're going to break. But I suppose the good news or the bad news is we don't in general. In general, we have a very, very, very difficult time. And yes, we hurt so deeply. But in general, we don't break completely. And I always say, actually, to clients is that even if you fall apart, you will fall together again one day. So that you can trust the process, because grief is a process. It may not feel like it because it doesn't have a sort of a process trajectory. It goes backwards and forwards, it goes sideways, it waxes, it wanes. It does exactly what it wants to do. And that's the important thing to try and do when you are in the throes of deep grieving, is to try and step out of your own way, funny enough. If we can just step out of our own way, grief has a wisdom of its own. Grief will continue its path, and it's a windy path. It's a path that goes off onto side roads and comes back on, and it's a path that we can't fathom. But the one thing is, it is always surely winding its way forward slowly. I stay well away from time heals because I know it's the most infuriating thing to be told when you're in the depths of grief. Whatever stage you're at, it is the most awful, silencing thing for people to say is, you will heal one day or whatever. So, I mean, the thing is that you will feel different one day. You won't be the same person you were when you began this journey. You will feel different, but life will have meaning again. And I'll say that again because it's important to know that. Life will develop new meaning. There will be new ways of celebrating. There will be new ways of working anniversaries and new ways of working birthdays. It won't be the same and they will be different, but you will find a new way of doing life. And that's what it's about, is really this trusting the process, because it's so scary. I cannot tell you how scary it was for me. So I know if you're listening and you're experiencing grief, or someone around you is, it really is the most frightening process we can go through, because there is no roadmap. There's no way of knowing whether it's right or wrong. And that's why I'm making this video, because I really would love to tell you that there is no right or wrong way to do grief. Providing you're staying away from the obvious dangerous pitfalls, providing you're staying away from, excess alcohol use, any drug use, or getting into prescription drug abuse or anything like that, providing you're just leading a relatively normal life. You can't go off track. You really can't, because you've got this sort of inbuilt psychological process that's happening behind the scenes. Now, of course, people need help with grief, and of course, people need support with grief. But I will say again, it's not a pathology in general. In general, that it's really something that we need to go through to come out the other side. And you might say to me, well, when is the other side coming, Rachel? When am I going to feel better? It comes and goes, it waxes and wanes. One day, you're absolutely devastated and crying, and you cannot stop leaking, as I call it, tears all over the place. Other days you can be completely numb. Other days you might even have a relatively normal day. Other days you can't get out of bed. Some days you haven't even got enough energy to cook your own food. Some days you could walk 10 miles. The reason I'm saying this is because there is no norm. There really is no norm. And there are no scales to the length of pain you can feel. I used to say that the pain in grief was exquisite. Now, most people would put exquisite next to something that's beautiful, but it was the only word I could come up with to describe the intensity, the depth of it, where it was in my body. It felt exquisite. There was only one word for it for me. So the level of pain, the level of sorrow, the level of hurting that you've got, it's individual, and it's individual to each person's experience of grief. And of course, remember, we're bringing all our past griefs with us when we experience another grief, okay? So it can be unresolved stuff, but worry not. All of that will get mopped up and processed over the time. And one thing I'm famous for saying is I love the fact that the Victorians had a year of mourning. I really do think when I was looking into grief, there was a whole reason for that. And for me, it was a psychological reason. And the other thing about it is, I'll come back to the meaning of that in a second, but the Victorians dressed in black. And we now have to grieve in modern terms, in modern society, without any outward display that we are in our grief. We don't wear a black armband or a black tie. We don't dress in black anymore. And I think there was so much value in being able to show outwardly that we were in the process of grief, because society would give us a wider berth. We'd be able to look for support in a better way. People would notice. Maybe people would be more compassionate and cut you more slack. But it's all very private now. It's all very hidden inside. And so we don't have any outward display of that. And I have another theory that I'd love to share with you. It goes back to the Victorian year of mourning, actually. There's something about the year. I've had quite a few losses, and I was able to recognize, once I'd come through the process and was in a fairly decent area of recovery, I was able to recognize that actually there's something in that year. And it's to do with being able to say this time last year. It's the last time you will be able to to look at an anniversary or a birthday or whatever it is in the same way, because after the 1 year anniversary, then you're moving into distance. So what I say and what I advise people is actually to honor this year. If you're in the first year of your mourning, go headlong into it. Be in mourning, be in your grief, and honor everything. I would love if everybody had a ritual around the first time without the person, and to find ways of creating meaning around that. There's plenty of time for finding new ways to live, and we can talk about that in another video. But the important thing is honor your grief. Don't try and not live it. Don't try and hide it so that people feel better around you. I think that this is a time for owning ourselves, and a time for, I don't think being selfish is the right word, but for being selfish in the way that you honor your feelings and honor what's coming up for you, and honor the fact that you have had something incredibly traumatic and life-changing occur for you. Why wouldn't you? If I'd have known that at the time, I was very young when my husband died in a really, really tragic accident. And I think that, first of all, I know I had PTSD, but the other thing was somehow I had shame around how deep my feelings were. I hid most of my loss. I hid it until I got home, and then I allowed it to pour out. And I did unhealthy things. I turned to wine and all sorts of things to somehow get in touch with my pain. And that's what a lot of people say to me. They say, I can't feel anything. I just don't feel anything at the moment. And now what I say is, very soon you will. Very soon it will make itself felt. You don't have to worry. In general, it's never going to be stuck in there for the rest of your life. And of course, we might want to avoid feeling it anyway, and that makes us push it away even more. So finding ways to kind of accept in a way that this is going to happen, this grief is going to come forward. It's scary, believe me. And when it does come in, it's like a train is arriving into you. And, you know, we just have to hold tough. As I say, if we can step out of our own way somehow and allow it to come through us, it doesn't feel any better, but it leaves us not feeling that we need to be doing anything. And I think that's the most important message, is we don't need to be doing anything with our grief. Okay? We don't need to have a degree in it either. Very few of us have that experience many, many, many times. And now I'd say I'm fortunate enough to have experienced different forms of grief, because I feel I can hold the space for other people. And having said that, actually, it reminds me to say to you that I don't treat people for grief in clinical hypnotherapy terms until well after the mourning process is over, and if there's complex grief. I like nature and the body and the natural psychology to do its thing, because we're incredibly wise as humans if we can just allow ourselves to go through the process. It doesn't feel good. I'm not trying to pretend it does. And it doesn't feel safe almost. It almost feels as if it's a very unsafe thing to do. But if you can trust that we have survived grief for millennia, not just centuries, millennia, you are also going to survive grief. It doesn't feel right now, I know, and it doesn't feel like it, and you don't want to. But I'm here to say that you're on track. That whatever you're feeling, you are completely on track. It's sad to say it, but that's the way it is for grief. But you have my absolute compassion. You've got my heart, because I do know that feeling of being completely and utterly at odds with the world. And it's the other thing as well, is that you have my compassion, because most people don't even know how to speak to somebody who's going through grief. Most people avoid people who are grieving. Most people don't know what to say. My hand's getting a bit sore. Most people don't know what to say to us. And so there's awkwardness, or there's, aren't you over that yet? There's, avoidance. And it's very difficult for people to understand it, because they're actually scared of grief. And that's the thing. People are scared of grief as much as they're scared of death. It's something they would rather stay away from. And I had that experience so many, many times through all my different griefs. People responded in different ways, and people were themselves in it. And I remember the hurt and not being able to comprehend that people could be what I perceived to be callous, how I perceived them to be thoughtless, how I perceived them to be uncaring. I don't think they weren't caring now that I'm out of it. It's just they were handling it their way. And so that's why it is important actually to have some support. And I don't mean really necessarily friend or family support if you can possibly manage it. Some support outside of your own network, somebody who you can reach into and be yourself and not have to put any veneers or blankets or blocks on, that you can actually just say it the way it is. If you could have 1 hour a week where you can download all the madness and all the fear and all the things that you don't understand to one person and have them validated, I think that's just be absolutely brilliant. And if that's not available to you, you could join forums, you could join something online just to be among people who aren't going to try and shut you up or close you down because they can't deal with your pain. And it really is only about people can't deal with your pain. The other thing about grief that I found extremely challenging was that the world carried on. And I'm sure you've had that experience yourself, that somehow the world keeps going. People keep working, people keep having parties, keep people enjoying themselves. I remember after my husband died, I couldn't understand how the boats had gone out. I lived in a fishing community. I just could not get my head around that the fishing boats had gone out when my world was completely and utterly ended as far as I was concerned. I just couldn't understand that people were smiling. It just didn't fit with me. So we just have to remember as well that they're not doing anything wrong either. Their lives haven't stopped, but people's lives do stop in different places. And now I even think of that myself when I'm living as I am now, and don't for 1 minute think, I don't know if grief is going to come my way anymore. It very well will. But I try and remind myself to think of people who are in grief, and I try and remind myself to get in touch, because I know that feeling of being left behind and the world continuing to go on without me. So it's also about just understanding that it's not personal. It's not directed at you. It's actually just as people's lives keep going and they keep moving on. And if you're brave enough to reach out, do that and tap somebody and say, hey, I'm feeling left out. But what does tend to happen is people just tend to move on to such a degree that they're confused that you're still in that place. So it's about reminding yourself as well that yes, you're on a different time scale to everybody else for a while. You're on a different trajectory. And, the world will somehow wind its way to feeling reasonably okay again. And people say to me then, how long? The answer is, I don't know. We don't know for each person how long it is going to take. But I do know that the more you go into it, the more you allow it and the more you accept it, the shorter the journey, believe it or not. But that doesn't mean to say I'm going to be able to tell you that in a week or 2 or months. It takes a long time. But you can live within that as well. You can live within your grief, because the mind gives you those wee little breaks. And that's why you mustn't feel guilty if you're having a good day. You mustn't feel guilty if you're not crying one day. You mustn't feel guilty if the sun on your face makes you smile one day. You mustn't feel guilty, because that is the natural break. That is the natural psychological break you've been given so that you don't go into complete overwhelm. So grab that opportunity when it comes. And when the depths of it come, just allow if you possibly can. I understand you've got to work or you've got to tend to children or whatever it is that the have-tos and the shoulds and musts in your life. But if you can make space for your grief, if you can allow it its expression, that is healthy. So don't pull away from crying or expressing your grief or allowing yourself to have a good old meltdown. I used to have lots of them, and it just gave me that pressure cooker release, the valve to release, so that I could actually get on with life for a little bit. So it's all about what comes up for you, and just knowing that it's normal. Normal for grief, normal for the place you're at, normal for the time frame, because there are no time frames, particularly in the first year and a half. But you will slowly wind your way to having better days. And in those better days, you don't celebrate them, you just take them and live as best as you can in them. There's a lot of self-care practice that I would like to talk about, but this video is getting quite long. So I think what I might do is end it, and I'll do another one in a week or so about the self-care practices that I adopted, that worked, and some that didn't work, and the self-care practices I could have done with knowing about. I think that, if we're going to take care of ourselves, we've also got to forgive ourselves for when we get it wrong, because I got it wrong many times, I can tell you. But you don't want to hear this, but you will be okay. You are on track. Whatever you're experiencing, it is normal. And if you get some good days, take them. Absolutely take them. And, it will wind its way naturally. And you are completely and utterly on track. All right. So I would really like to know how you find this video, and if it's been of any help, and if you feel it's of help to anyone else, please share it to them. Please offer it to people. It's a bit long, but grief is a subject that we can't just offer in a few minutes. It's too much of a subject, and I'd like to be in touch with you more about grief. Let me know if grief is a subject that I can help you with, because it is a subject close to my own heart, and it's a subject I'm very happy to hold a space about too. And if I can be of service, then do let me know. Okay, thanks.